Hello, I'm Andrew Lowe, and I want to start by thanking Norman Augustine, Gaurav Madhavan, and the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine for allowing me to participate in this event. I also want to apologize for participating remotely. This is my teaching semester, so I'm not able to get away as easily. But I really wanted to participate because this is an incredibly important gathering, and I also want to thank all of you in the audience who are developing the wonderful therapies for patients and their family members. I want to begin with a disclaimer, which is that I am not a biomedical expert by any means. I'm not even a healthcare economist. My background is in financial economics, and I realize that that's a really small piece of the much larger puzzle that all of you are dealing with regard to making breakthrough therapies more affordable. But I do think that finance plays an important role, and what I'd like to do over the next 10 or 15 minutes is to share with you some research that my co-authors, Vahid Montezer-Hojat and David Weinstock, and I have been doing on applying financial concepts to making these drugs more affordable. And the question that I want to deal with is, can we afford these therapies? Now, you probably all recognize this individual. For a short time, he was the most hated man in America. And I want to make the distinction right away between the difference between price gouging behavior, which is not acceptable in any industry, including the financial industry, but there's a difference between that and the pricing of very expensive breakthrough therapies. So I'd like to start with a simple example, the example of hepatitis C. Recently, a drug was developed that actually cures hepatitis C, a drug called Sovaldi, developed by Gilead. This is a 12-week course of treatment that at the end of which you are completely cured of the disease once and for all. And when I first came upon this incredible breakthrough, I was absolutely amazed. And I don't know much about drug pricing and the underlying pharmacoeconomics, but the alternative of a cure is having to deal with the consequences of hep C. Eventually, the liver will have to be replaced, and so a liver transplant is going to have to be done. And the cost of a liver transplant back in 2011 was over $500,000. In some cases, patients die. And the cost of a life saved, according to government estimates of the value of a statistical life, is some fraction of $9.1 million. So I thought to myself, well, the price of this must be really significant because what you're offering patients is a lifetime of health as opposed to an ongoing set of chronic treatments. So what would you pay for this one-time treatment? Now, most of you probably know what the list price is. When I first came across this, I thought, well, maybe it's priced at $1 million, $2 million. And when I found out that the list price was $84,000, I was shocked. I thought, what an amazing bargain. And yet, at that time, when this was announced, there was a tremendous amount of controversy. And part of the reason is that if we think about treating every hepatitis C patient in the United States, there are over 3 million of them, it ends up being extraordinarily costly, which is why Congress started pushing back, dragging the CEO of Gilead before it, asking why he was charging such an extraordinary price, and other politicians arguing that we should simply expropriate the intellectual property. Now, I have to say that as an economist, I was really quite shocked by that reaction, because from my perspective, it seemed like an incredibly good deal. Around the same time that Sovaldi was introduced, it turns out that Tesla introduced their very fancy-looking Model S sedan. And I have to tell you, I was quite taken with that. So I got on the Tesla website, and I configured the particular sedan that I wanted most. And at the end of that process, I discovered that the version that I wanted was about $84,000, the same as the list price for Sovaldi. And so I didn't understand why it was that Congress didn't drag Elon Musk before it and chastise him for being so greedy and not allowing all of us to buy a Tesla for a lower price than $84,000. There's a difference between Sovaldi and a Tesla Model S. The difference is you don't need a Model S to live. But the fact is that this tells us that there's a difference between medicines and other kinds of products and services, and that economics alone doesn't really answer all of the issues that we have to deal with. There's an ethical and moral dimension to medical technology that we have to address. And so many of the questions that all of you are dealing with today are not questions that are going to be answerable by economists. But I want to add that economics does provide some very useful input, and in certain aspects, financial economics and financing could actually lower the cost to all concerned, and that might make some of these issues easier to resolve. So let me start with the proposition that the cost of Sovaldi and other transformational drugs is actually something that we actually can deal with by using finance to lower the cost impact. So it's not that Sovaldi isn't a bargain, it's that the one-time payment is the hurdle that has to be handled. And we have methods of dealing with that very easily in finance, namely taking a large lump sum payment and spreading it out over the life of the particular asset. So a good example is a home. If any of us would have to purchase a home outright in cash, very few of us would be able to afford it. But a home lasts for many years. And so if we somehow stretch out the payments to get a little bit closer to the service flows of a home, we might actually be able to make it more affordable. Well, of course, you know that's exactly what happened with the mortgage industry. We were able to increase home ownership precisely by stretching out those payments. The same can be done for drugs. Imagine creating drug mortgages. So in the case of Sovaldi, take $84,000, the list price, which not everybody pays, but let's suppose that we were looking to finance $84,000. If you spread out that one-time payment into 10 years of monthly payments at a 5% interest rate, we're looking at monthly payments of about $900, roughly the cost of a fancy car payments. And so this certainly will be able to increase access. Now, this is not a new idea, this notion of amortization, of spreading out payments. But what about if we took all of the tricks of the financial trade, things like securitization, credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, and applied them to this market? We published a paper earlier this year that showed that actually the profitability of the securities associated with the venture would be able to support a large amount of funding for these kinds of treatments. In other words, investors would actually benefit from this. We use simulations calibrating our analysis to the student loan market. That's another example where you have unsecuritized borrowing by individuals. And in that case, we found that for particular kinds of healthcare mortgages, the returns to investors are actually quite attractive. Not only are they attractive, but from a larger perspective, they actually fit very well in the needs of the financial industry. Many, many lenders would be delighted to participate in these markets. So now let me turn to the biggest question of all, which is who pays? In the very long run, we argue that the government should pay for these things because that's what the government does. When we're dealing with large threats to public health, we engage in the taxpayer base to be able to spread out the risks and the costs over many, many generations and many people over time. But the very long run may be difficult to get to, particularly in periods where it's difficult to get consensus from politicians. In the long run, we think payers, insurance companies should pay because that's, of course, why we have health insurance. The challenge there is that insurance is really an intermediary that takes risks and spreads them out across large populations of individuals. There are challenges with that process, though, because if you can't recoup the cost of paying for the people that need the insurance to those who are actually providing the premia, there may be difficulties in sustaining that kind of an insurance policy. So one particular challenge is if you pay expensive therapies for individuals that subsequently leave the plan, you're going to have a very hard time recouping those costs because you're paying for the therapies up front. If, on the other hand, insurance companies were allowed to amortize their payments, so they paid the one-time therapy for a particular plan participant, but they spread out those payments over many years. If the plan participant leaves after 2 or 3 years, he or she takes that obligation with him or her to the new plan, and the new plan is responsible for the remaining payments. If we're actually able to do that, and all that requires is a stroke of a pen by including in pre-existing conditions, pre-existing financial conditions, if insurance companies have to take on patients regardless of their pre-existing financial conditions, then that might be workable. But that requires new legislation. That might not happen anytime soon. Finally, In the short run, we would argue that patients, families, and philanthropists need to step up and pay for these therapies. And that's frankly what consumer loans and charities are for. Now, I understand that expecting patients to pay for these expensive therapies and mortgaging their health can be quite offensive. I'm offended by that as well. But I find it more offensive to allow patients to die when we have the financial and medical means to save them. So I think in the short run, these healthcare loans can actually serve that purpose. Now, is this really a good idea? Well, the short answer is I don't know. And I'm hoping that the individuals that are at today's meeting will help us to be able to answer that question. But I have a few conjectures that I think might cause this idea to actually be feasible and beneficial. And those ideas have to do with the fact that, number one, debt markets are tremendously large, much, much larger than most other ordinary funding sources. At the end of 2015, we had $39 trillion in the US debt markets. So clearly, there's an enormous amount of capital looking for a home. In fact, one source of that capital could be drug manufacturers themselves. Pharma companies have a lot of cash on their balance sheets. They could use that cash to provide loans to patients in the same way that automobile manufacturers often create auto loan divisions to provide loans to people who want to buy cars. Second, consumer credit is well understood, well analyzed. We know how to make these loans, and there are a number of lenders that are in the position of being able to do that today. Third, personal health, in my opinion, is a great investment, especially compared to the other alternatives that we think of. Buying a vacation home, a fancy car, spending it on home renovations. I would argue that personal health ought to be at the top of that list of investments that will yield tremendous returns. Also, it'll actually create greater incentives for pharma companies to come up with cures as opposed to chronic methods of management. If you think about a drug like Gleevec, which treats leukemia, it's about $100,000 a year. You take it as long as you live. That is a chronic set of payments and treatments, whereas a cure, a one-time payment, could offer tremendous benefits in a variety of different contexts. I think it'll also improve diet, exercise, and prevention. Once we start having literal skin in the game, we'll actually take our health quite a bit more seriously. It'll also be very consistent with the movement towards value and pay for performance. If you have a one-time therapy and you've payments over the course of several years, if after 2 or 3 years that therapy no longer works, stop the payments. It aligns the interests of all the parties concerned. And finally, this whole process will actually make the healthcare system more economically efficient in terms of allowing individuals to afford better therapies and providing the incentives for those therapies to get created. So new business models are emerging even as we speak to deal with this. We've got lending online for various different purposes, and a number of these online lenders like SoFi and Lending Club are already making healthcare loans. So they're not doing it in a packaged, consistent way that lowers the cost of capital, but certainly they stand ready to do that if we're actually able to provide them with the proper context. Also, for state Medicaid plans that have a very difficult time funding, well, there are also ways of improving their funding sources. The state of Massachusetts has made the decision to provide everyone with Sovaldi for hepatitis C. Ultimately, that's going to cost taxpayers something, but that can be funded through municipal bonds over the course of even multiple generations of individuals. So I want to conclude by pointing out that on occasion, we've declared war on various diseases. We had a war on cancer, a war on certain infectious diseases. I'm not qualified to say whether we're winning or losing those wars. But as an economist, I would argue that war is the wrong metaphor because war is based on fear and hate, and those are simply not sustainable. You can't be fearful and you can't hate forever. Greed, on the other hand, is very sustainable. And so if we can put a price tag on the heads of all of these terrible afflictions, we can actually make much more progress more quickly. At the proper scale, you can actually do well by doing good. Finance does not have to be a zero-sum game if we don't let it. And with the help of the people in this room today, I think we can come up with better solutions and increase patient access to these therapies at a much more affordable rate. I want to thank you, and hopefully if the internet is working, I'll be joining you in real time. Thank you.